Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere thick with smoke, damp with mildew, and buzzing with life and lice. We're stepping into a world of gaslight shadows and cobbled streets, of chimneys coughing soot, and back alleys slick with rain and rot. Welcome to the smog-filled slums of Victorian England, where comfort is rare, hygiene is a rumour, and tenants, like our quiet narrator, lived every day inside a grey, grinding sort of misery. Not misery with drama, just the dull, itchy kind that never really left you alone. Before we settle in, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, only if you're really enjoying the content I share here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this little community reaches. Make sure you're as comfortable as the 19th century wouldn't let you be. Dim your lights, pull that blanket close, and take a deep breath. Of clean air, hopefully. Because tonight, we'll trace the daily rhythms of a life wrapped in wool, soaked in coal smoke and softened only by stolen moments of quiet. There's no scandal here, no dramatic uprisings. Just chamber pots, cracked tea mugs, and skin that never quite stops itching. A life as it was one long century ago. Let's begin. The morning did not arrive with golden light or cheerful birdsong. It crept in like a damp whisper through cracked shutters and soot-streaked windows, weaving its way across the warped floorboards of number 14 Hogsfoot Lane. A boarding tenement nestled in one of the quieter, more forgettable corners of East End London. The first signs of life weren't the chirps of a clock, but the wheezing breath of an old man 2 doors down, tangled in his own blanket of consumption. Outside, the fog was thick, not the gentle countryside mist of romantic postcards, but a yellowish industrial murk laced with coal dust and the sighs of distant chimneys. The kind of fog that stuck to your clothes, your skin, and your soul, and never quite left you alone. Within the single room that Clara rented, shared, of course, with her 3 children and 1 disapproving cat, the air was neither warm nor dry. It hovered somewhere between cold breath and damp rag, thick with the scent of boiled cabbage from the night before, and the unmistakable tang of mildew that lived permanently in the wallpaper. The wallpaper, once perhaps a cheerful floral, now resembled a faded bruise, peeling at the edges and curling like a sleeping spider. Clara stirred not because she wanted to, but because the roof had begun to drip again. A slow, rhythmic plop of water hitting the tin bowl she'd placed beside the stove last month, and never dared empty for fear of jinxing its efficiency. She lay there for a moment longer, staring at the wooden ceiling beams blackened with decades of soot. Her mattress crackled slightly as she shifted, not with luxury springs or cotton stuffing, but with straw so aged it had the colour and scent of an old scarecrow. At night, the straw welcomed the crawling creatures that shared the tenement. The lice were the quietest guests, persistent but shy. The fleas were bolder, nipping at ankles and burrowing into seams. But the bedbugs, they were the ruling class. They came out after dusk like tiny, methodical landlords collecting rent in skin. Clara didn't fight them anymore. She simply adjusted the children's blanket and hoped they found her blood too sour from exhaustion to be of interest. A muffled cry echoed from somewhere below. Likely the Higgins baby in room 6, a permanent resident of the ground floor's chorus of damp, groaning pipes and nighttime quarrels. Clara closed her eyes for a moment longer, not to sleep, but to delay the act of pulling back the covers and facing the chill that clung to her bones. There was no hearth in her room, just an iron stove that required fuel she could rarely afford. Coal cost pennies. Her purse held half of 1. Eventually duty always beat comfort. She rose slowly, shoulders aching from the unforgiving straw and the previous day's washing. Her shift, draped across a nail in the wall, smelled faintly of lye and heavily of the communal washroom where it had hung for hours, brushing shoulders with every other tenant's laundry, some of which hadn't seen soap in weeks. She dressed without ceremony, tugging wool stockings over feet that were already numbing. The wool itched. It always itched. Beneath her shift, Clara wore nothing, undergarments being a luxury reserved for those whose weeks were not shaped by laundry schedules and soot collections. By the time she'd finished tying her shoes, scuffed leather, one with a hole near the toe and both 2 sizes too large, the children were stirring. Their beds, if they could be called that, were pallets on the floor, lined with thin blankets and one shared pillow. They didn't complain. The children of Hogsfoot Lane rarely did. They coughed, they scratched, they whispered at night. But they understood without words that complaint was wasted air in a place where even breath came second-hand through coal smoke and despair. Clara pulled open the window an inch, just enough to let out some of the stink of damp clothing and sour air, but not enough to invite in the worst of the morning chill. The smell that came in was somehow worse, a mixture of horse droppings, ash, yesterday's fish, and something faintly chemical, likely from the matchstick factory 2 streets over. She closed the window again and lit the small oil lamp. Its light was weak and amber, casting tall shadows across the cracked floorboards and revealing the grey film that coated every surface. Dust was not the enemy here. Dust was expected. It was the living grime that made itself known. The sticky fingerprints of the city itself on doorknobs, windowsills, and plates left unwashed because water was too cold and soap too precious. Breakfast, if it could be called that, came from the corner of the cupboard. Stale bread, half a loaf from yesterday's vendor, traded for mending a widow's torn shawl. Clara sliced it with a dull knife, careful not to break the crust too loudly lest she wake the baby fully. There was tea, weak as hope, brewed from reused leaves and poured sparingly into enamel mugs chipped enough to tell their own stories. No sugar. That had run out days ago. The children, still half asleep, sipped quietly, grateful more for the warmth than the taste. Outside the window, the street was beginning to groan awake. Carts rattled over uneven stones, hawkers shouted in ragged voices, and boots splashed through puddles, filled not with rain, but with washwater, ale, and worse. A woman from across the lane emptied her chamber pot with a practiced motion, barely pausing to shout a warning. The liquid hit the cobblestones below with a splash that sent rats scurrying. Clara turned from the window. Better not to look too long. In Victorian London, modesty was not about skin. It was about pretending the filth wasn't everywhere. The children dressed one by one in the same garments they'd worn yesterday and would likely wear tomorrow. The youngest had a tear in his shirt where a button had been. Clara would fix it tonight, or next week if she could find a spare. Buttons were not luxuries they took lightly. When they stepped outside, the oldest took the baby's hand and Clara gave them both a nod. They would walk to the factory district, perhaps find scraps, perhaps find nothing. But they would be out of the room for a few hours, and the air, poisonous as it was, still beat the staleness of home. She watched them leave, then turned to the stove. It was cold and silent. No fire today, just chores. She fetched the wash basin and the rag, dipped it in the rain barrel outside, and began to clean. Not for cleanliness, that was a dream for other classes. No, she cleaned for dignity. In a world that smelled of coal and cabbage, that crawled with lice and whispered sickness through the walls, a wiped surface was a protest, a rebellion. a reminder that even in the slums, humanity still lived. There was a certain ritual to the morning walk to the washroom, if you could call a cracked brick lean-to behind the building a washroom. Clara knew every uneven step along the flagstone path, every broken tile that jutted just high enough to trip a half-awake soul, and every soggy patch where grey water pooled from last night's overflows. This wasn't a place for luxuries. It was a place for cold fingers, cold water, and colder stares from neighbours too tired to speak. She carried the slop pail in one hand and the cleaning rag in the other, her skirt bunched slightly at the hip to avoid the splash of unseen things beneath her boots. The pail was heavier than it looked, not for the waste itself, but for the quiet shame that came with carrying it. Everyone in the building had to make that walk eventually, but no one enjoyed the feeling of their own filth sloshing beside them, especially not while passing the judgy eyes of the ground-floor widow, who always found a way to wrinkle her nose at just the right moment. The washroom door groaned when it opened, it always did, a long, scratchy yawn of iron hinges rusted by rain and years of indifference. Inside, the smell changed. Here, it wasn't cabbage or mildew, but a thick stew of wet laundry, old soap, and the human steam that clung to the wood like skin. A single tin basin sat crookedly atop a plank of wood nailed into the brick wall. There was a pump, but it worked only when it felt charitable, which wasn't often. Clara tested it with one hand, a groan, a sigh, and then eventually a reluctant trickle. Cold as bone and about as clean as a public fountain used for everything but drinking. She poured a little into her tin bowl, then added her rag, stirring it slowly like soup. The water turned grey almost immediately. She didn't even need to add soap. The cloth carried its own residue from a dozen past scrubbings. She dipped her hands in and hissed, always cold. It was summer in name, but the mornings had a bite that didn't care what the calendar said. Clara scrubbed her forearms first, then her face, using the edge of the rag to wipe at the corners of her eyes and the back of her neck. There was no mirror, just the faint sheen of her reflection in the metal basin, distorted and fogged. Still she could tell the lice had returned. A scratch behind the ear, a familiar crawling near the hairline. She sighed. Not today, she thought. Today there was no vinegar left. Other women began to filter in one by one. Quietly, with that same early morning stiffness, the kind that crept into joints like coal smoke and refused to leave. No one spoke much. The slum didn't start its conversations until the children were loud enough to drown out adult complaints. Clara offered a small nod to the woman from the room across the hall, Miss Holloway, sharp-eyed and always pale, who scrubbed her nails with terrifying intensity each morning, as though trying to erase something more than just dirt. The silence between them wasn't unfriendly. It was simply the language of survival. Brief glances, measured nods, and the occasional shared towel when one had too much and the other not enough. Back in the room, the oil lamp still burned low. Clara snuffed it with 2 fingers and wrapped the remaining bread crusts in an old cloth. The cat, Mrs. Ginger's, who was not ginger at all but a smoky black and white, wound herself around Clara's legs, mewing in a tone that suggested either hunger or mild judgment. Likely both. Clara placed a scrap of bread on the floor for her, even though cats didn't eat bread. It was more of an offering, a gesture that said, "We're all surviving here. Do your part and keep the rats away." Outside, the alley that fed into Hogsfoot Lane had begun to crowd. Rag pickers, chimney boys, milkmen, coal runners, and the odd clerk trying to beat the omnibus to his post. Everyone had somewhere to be, even if that somewhere didn't want them. Clara adjusted her shawl, an old knitted thing full of holes that smelled permanently of smoke and starch, and stepped into the street with the ease of someone who no longer looked for carriages before crossing. If you waited for safety, you'd never get anywhere. Her first stop was the grocer's stoop, where she knelt to scrub the stone tiles in exchange for a bruised onion and the hope of a carrot. The owner didn't speak to her, just nodded toward the bucket and brush left out overnight. She didn't mind. Words were heavier than water, and she needed the food more than conversation. As she scrubbed, knees aching and hands red with cold, she watched the smoke billow from the rooftops above. Some chimneys belched black plumes, others puffed softly, like someone sighing into winter air. And some didn't smoke at all. Those were the homes where no fire had been lit, no breakfast boiled. Homes like hers. The grocer tossed her a cloth sack with the meagre payment inside, a shriveled onion, half a carrot, and a lump of something that might have been turnip. She nodded in thanks, wiped her hands on her skirt, and moved on. The sun had finally broken through the fog, or at least tried to. The light it offered was weak and yellowish, catching only the grime on the windows and the rust on the rails. Still, it made the bricks glow faintly, and in that light, Clara allowed herself one full breath, not clean, not fresh, but less sour than usual. She returned to the tenement by mid-morning, the stairs creaking beneath her as she climbed. Her feet were numb, her elbows stiff, and a blister had begun to form beneath her left heel where her sock had slipped and rubbed raw. Still, she moved without complaint. This was her rhythm. Wake, clean, walk, beg, return, and repeat. Day after day after day. There was a comfort in the repetition, even if it came wrapped in aches. Back in the room, the stillness greeted her. A rare moment of silence. She placed the onion and carrot beside the tea tin and peeled off her shawl. The cat stretched lazily and resumed her watch near the window. Outside, the sounds of the city resumed their usual hum. Carts rolling, vendors shouting, children laughing or crying, and the distant toll of a bell that meant either noon or trouble. Clara didn't care which. She had soup to make, lice to ignore, and a floor to sweep before the children returned. The knock came mid-afternoon, just as Clara was lowering the onion into the pot of gently bubbling water. It wasn't a knock, really, but a flat-palmed pound, heavy and blunt, the way only a landlord or a city inspector ever knocked. The kind of knock that told you it didn't care if you were busy. Clara flinched, not because she was guilty of anything, but because knocks like that rarely brought good news. She wiped her hands on her skirt, whispered a quiet "stay there" to the cat, and opened the door with her whole body blocking the view behind her. Privacy in a room with no partitions was a rare and fragile thing. Standing on the landing was a man in a brown bowler hat and a coat too fine for the building. Behind him, a thinner man scribbled on a clipboard, his pencil twitching like a nervous tail. "Mrs. Booth?" the first man said, not asking so much as announcing. Clara nodded. "Sanitary Inspection Board," he added, as if the badge pinned to his lapel didn't speak loud enough. The words filled the hall with their own kind of smell. Not filth, but formality. The city had sent inspectors before, but only when someone complained or died. This didn't feel like a death call, but it wasn't casual either. He stepped inside without being asked. They always did. Clara stood to the side, swallowing the small embarrassment of the room's condition. The mildew smell, the damp spots on the ceiling, the soot-black rim around the stove. The inspector sniffed once, audibly. His eyes skimmed the room like he was scanning livestock, not a home. "How many reside here?" he asked, not looking at her. "4, Clara replied. "Myself and 3 children." The man with the clipboard scribbled something. "Any boarders?" "No," she said quickly. No subletting. That was a lie, of course. Sometimes the neighbour's eldest boy slept near the stove on cold nights, but Clara wasn't about to volunteer that detail. The inspector crouched near the stove, squinting at the flue. He jabbed a finger toward a bucket in the corner. Night soil kept indoors? She shook her head. Just a rain pail, leak from the ceiling. He stood, sniffed again and walked to the window. Opened it, winced. The alley beyond let out a breath of rot and smoke. Drainage? We take waste to the rear gutter, Clara said, folding her hands tightly. Her fingers were stained with coal dust and cabbage water. And bathing? The washhouse. Another lie. The washhouse had closed weeks ago due to a pipe burst no one had repaired. Most tenants now washed at the pump behind the grocer's, or not at all. The man with the clipboard asked, "Any infestation?" Clara hesitated, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she knew it too well. "Some lice," she murmured. "Common, I think. Not dangerous." The inspector finally looked at her then, not unkindly, but not kindly either. Just a tired glance from someone who had seen too many rooms like this one. "No illness?" "Only colds," Clara said, "and the cough sometimes when the fog's bad." He nodded, then turned toward the door. "We'll file a report, likely nothing immediate, but you'll need to fix the leak." Clara bit back the urge to laugh, as if she hadn't already tried, as if fixing the roof didn't require a landlord with a conscience and money he didn't spend on gin. She nodded. "Of course." The inspector paused. "Children in school?" "Yes." Another lie. Only one of them had a spot, and even that was occasional, when boots and books could be borrowed. He nodded again. "That's good. Keep them clean." And with that, they left, their boots echoing down the stairs, their clipboards swinging like a gavel behind them. Clara closed the door gently. The room seemed smaller after visits like that, more visible. The pot still bubbled softly, releasing a watery onion scent that tried very hard to smell like soup. She sat down beside it, knees stiff, and exhaled. She wasn't in trouble, not yet. But the report might land on a desk where papers turned into fines or warnings. And fines turned into evictions. And evictions turned into the street. She stirred the pot. It was mostly water. A slice of carrot floated near the surface, looking vaguely embarrassed to be alone. She added a pinch of salt, the last she had, and stared at the oil lamp, wondering if it had the energy for another night. Later, as the light began to fade and the smog rolled in with its usual sluggish certainty, the children returned. Boots muddy, cheeks grey with soot, eyes drooping. They didn't speak much. The middle one, Annie, handed her a scrap of bread someone had dropped near the baker's stall. Clara took it with a quiet nod and tore it in 3. That was dinner. Soup and bread, same as yesterday. Same as likely tomorrow. As they ate, the youngest, Tommy, scratched at his scalp with 2 fingers. Clara reached over gently, parting his curls. Lice, of course. The telltale white specks clung to the shafts like sticky dandruff. "We'll fix it soon," she whispered. "Some vinegar next week. Maybe soap if Mrs. Holloway sells her extra." The boy nodded, already half asleep, his hands cupped around the warm bowl. After supper, they curled up on the mattress, a tangle of elbows and worn blankets. The room dimmed. The cat took her post near the window again, tail flicking at shadows. Clara sat up a little longer, watching the fog thicken outside. It clung to the lamplight like an old shawl, smothering sound and stretching the night. Somewhere in the distance, a watchman's bell rang, not loudly, just enough to remind the city it was being watched. Not that anyone watched this street. The law came only for the dead or the loud. The rest of them drifted, like soot in the air. Seen, but not quite noticed. She closed her eyes, hands wrapped around her knees, and breathed in the slum. The scent of coal, cabbage, damp wool, and fatigue. Home. Rain came in the early hours, not a dramatic storm with thunder and sweeping gusts, but the quiet, pitiless kind that settled in for the long haul. It tapped gently at the window panes of number 14 Hogsfoot Lane, ran down the glass in thin veins, and collected along the warped windowsill in a way that made it clear the wood had given up resisting. Inside, the room grew colder by degrees. Damp crept into the corners like gossip, soaking into the children's socks, slipping between the floorboards, and curling beneath the tin bowl Clara had placed beneath the leak 2 weeks ago. She hadn't emptied it since, just shifted it from spot to spot, following the slow drip like a waltz across rotting timber. She was already awake when the rain began in earnest, not from any noise but from the strange alertness that sometimes grips the body when sleep feels unsafe. Her arms wrapped around her knees, she listened. To the soft, wet sound of water on roof tile, to the shallow breathing of children pressed together for warmth, and to the occasional shuffle behind the walls that suggested a rat on its nightly patrol. Mrs. Gingers, ever loyal in her particular way, had caught one the week before. Clara had found it near the stove, stiff and grotesque, and had to remove it with an old coal shovel while the children looked away. The cat watched her do it, then resumed her nap with a satisfied blink. That was the deal. She kept the rats in check, and Clara offered scraps of bread and the occasional stroke behind the ears. She didn't light the lamp. Oil was running low, and there was no reason to waste it on watching the rain. Instead, she dressed slowly, easing each foot into a damp wool stocking that had not fully dried overnight. The hole in her left shoe had widened again, and though she told herself she'd find someone to patch it soon, she knew the truth. No one in the lane had extra leather, and her fingers were too raw to sew anything but linens. So she wrapped the toe in a strip of cloth, torn from an old curtain, and hoped the rain wouldn't soak through too quickly. The hallway smelled worse than usual. The wet brought everything to the surface. Mold, mouse droppings, the sour tinge of old cooking oil that had seeped into the stairs over the years. Clara stepped over a bucket someone had abandoned near the landing, probably filled with rain from a broken drain pipe, and made her way down to the main door. Outside, puddles had already begun to form in the usual places. The dip near the butcher's post, the patch by the alley grating that never drained properly. Across the street, someone had hung laundry beneath a tin awning, and the wind was playing with it like a child, with handkerchiefs, flipping shirts and tugging at damp sleeves. She headed toward the grocer's again, not because she needed food, but because news tended to settle there like crumbs. The grocer himself was barely visible behind a wall of crates and cloudy jars, but the women gathered nearby were already muttering in low tones wrapped in shawls and worry. Clara stepped close enough to hear. One of the newer tenants, a girl barely 20, had taken ill. Not a cough, but something worse. Fever, tremors, possibly typhus, someone whispered, or maybe diphtheria. The rumors changed with every sentence, each one darker than the last. "She hasn't left her bed in 2 days," one woman said, adjusting the basket on her hip. "Landlord doesn't want a doctor and says it'll bring inspectors back." Another nodded. "Doctor won't come without coin anyway. They say her skin's gone blotchy, blue around the lips." Clara said nothing, but her stomach turned in that slow, heavy way it did when bad things seemed inevitable. Disease was the real landlord here. It could move through walls, under doors, from spoon to mouth and back again. And no one had the means to stop it. If the girl died, it would mean more visits, more questions, maybe even quarantines. The last time that happened, 2 families had been turned out of the building entirely. No rent refunds, no relocation. Just gone like stains scrubbed from the steps. She picked up a small sack of oats in exchange for scrubbing the rear wall later in the week. Her fingers already tensed at the thought of cold stone and wet rags. As she walked back, the rain grew steadier, not heavy but insistent, like a reminder that nothing stayed dry in this part of the city. She paused near the alley that led to the rear of the tenement, watching 2 boys try to coax a coal cart's wheel out of a rut. The driver smoked lazily, offering no help. Clara admired their determination. Even in dirt and drizzle they worked, because there was no other choice. Back in the room, she found the youngest still asleep and the cat needing a blanket like it owed her money. She set the oats down beside the stove and opened the cupboard to check the tins. Not much. Tea, some salt, the last edge of a potato she'd kept wrapped in a rag. It was enough to make a thin porridge, perhaps with some turnip scrap for flavour. She stirred the mixture with slow circles, watching the steam rise in a tight, silent spiral. The smell was bland but warm. Better than nothing. A knock came again, but softer this time. It was Annie, the girl from the room across the hall. Her eyes were wide, her sleeves soaked through. "Mrs. Booth," she whispered. "It's the girl in room 2. She's shaking bad. They want womenfolk to sit with her. Just to, not leave her alone." Clara hesitated only a second before nodding. She placed a lid on the pot, whispered to the cat again, and stepped into the hall. Room 2 was darker than hers and smelled worse. Sharp with sweat, sickness, and something metallic. The girl lay twisted beneath a sheet, her mouth slack, eyes fluttering. Her hair clung to her forehead like seaweed. A woman sat beside her, holding a cloth to the girl's lips. "She's gone too hot," the woman muttered. "And she's muttering things." Clara stepped in and took a seat at the foot of the bed. No one told her what to do. She simply began dabbing the girl's wrist with a damp cloth, using water from a cracked bowl on the chair beside her. There were no prayers, no doctors, just steam and wet rugs and the quiet pact of women who had seen this before and knew there was little to be done. Clara stayed for an hour, maybe more. She didn't watch the clock. Time in these moments was measured in heartbeats and breaths, and the fear of hearing neither. By morning, the fever girl was still alive, not better, but not gone. A quiet triumph, if one could call it that. Clara had returned to her room just after dawn, her knees stiff from sitting on the edge of the sickbed, and her hands still damp from the cloth she'd left soaking in the chipped basin. The children hadn't stirred. They slept in the same woven sprawl as always, their limbs tangled like roots beneath the fraying blanket. The cat was curled beneath the stove, tail over eyes, giving no indication that anything in the world had changed or mattered. Clara exhaled. It was a long, slow breath, not one of relief exactly, but of endurance. She moved as though through water, every motion weighed down by the quiet heaviness that came from long hours near illness. That soft, choking dread that made you wash your hands twice and keep your thoughts quiet. The porridge she'd left behind had thickened into a gluey mass, but she scraped it back into the pot anyway, added water, and stirred until it loosened. Waste was not a sin in the slums, it was a betrayal. To waste food meant you'd overestimated your survival. She reheated the pot slowly, watching steam curl from its rim, then spooned portions into the children's chipped mugs and sat them upright one by one. No one spoke. They ate with the same methodical rhythm as always, their eyes still half closed, their bodies unwilling to admit the day had begun. The youngest had developed a cough. Nothing deep, just the shallow bark that came with damp air and thin clothes. But Clara noted it all the same, a silent inventory of future worry. By the time the sun had fully risen, or rather, by the time the grey of night had turned into the lighter grey of day, the street had filled again with the weary churn of labour. Carts rattled by, leaving wheel tracks in the sludge. Vendors called out their wares with the weariness of men who no longer believed in commerce, but had nothing else to do. Across the lane, the same old woman emptied the same chamber pot in the same careless ark, and Clara, as always, looked away before it hit the stones, rituals of survival, no different from prayer. She wrapped her shawl tight and prepared for the walk to the charity hall, not for food this time, but coal, or rather, the hope of coal. Rumour had it the parish office had been granted a new shipment for the poor. That meant 3, maybe 4 lumps per household, if you queued early and knew how to curtsy. The walk to the hall took only 10 minutes, but the line outside made it feel longer. It snaked down the block, hunched figures in threadbare coats, shifting from foot to foot. Most of them were women, the occasional child in tow, their hands wrapped in sleeves and their noses red from cold. No one spoke. Conversations like warmth were in short supply. When Clara reached the steps, she was greeted by a man with a ledger and an expression carved from wood. "Name?" he asked. "Booth." "Clara," she replied. He squinted at the page, traced a finger, and finally grunted. "3 children?" "Yes." "Any illness?" "No," she lied again. He reached behind him and retrieved a burlap sack, a small one. She could hear the clink of coal lumps inside, no more than a day's worth if she was careful. "Next," he barked, already looking past her. She didn't thank him, it would have felt dishonest. The sack was heavier than it looked, or perhaps she was simply tired. She slung it over her shoulder, feeling the sharp edges press through the cloth and bite into her collarbone. The walk home felt longer than the walk there. The street was slick with fresh horse leavings and last night's rain. At one point, she had to step aside as a delivery cart came thundering through the puddles, splashing her skirt with a mixture of mud and God knew what. She didn't flinch, just kept walking. Back in the room, she poured the coal carefully into a wooden box by the stove, counting each lump as it fell. 12. Enough for 3 small fires, 4 if she rationed well. She wrapped the empty sack and stored it behind the cupboard. Even threadbare burlap had value here. Then she lit the stove, watching the coal catch slowly, its dull orange glow spreading like an ember waking from sleep. The warmth was modest, barely enough to edge away the chill, but it made the room smell less like damp wool and more like something human. The children gathered near the stove without being asked. They sat in silence, each one inching closer to the heat with the slow reverence of pilgrims. Clara ladled out a second round of porridge, thinner than the first, but warm, and watched them eat. Outside, the sky had turned a darker shade of grey. Rain again. Maybe sleet. She hoped the ceiling wouldn't drip. The rest of the day passed slowly as most days did. Clara mended a stocking, patching the heel with a scrap from an old undershirt. She boiled a rag in vinegar water, the last of the vinegar, and used it to comb the children's hair, hunting for lice with practiced fingers. She swept the floor, shook out the blanket, scrubbed the chamber pot, lit the lamp only once to thread a needle. Each task small, but together they formed the only defense she had against the chaos always waiting beyond the door. That night, as the city wheezed and groaned beneath its blanket of smoke, Clara sat by the stove, elbows on knees, staring into the flicker of coals. She didn't think in words, just images. The girl in room 2, her lips turning blue. The sack of coal, now nearly empty. The inspector's clipboard. The cough in her youngest child's chest. The hush of women in the charity line. And the thin, defiant fire still holding on inside the stove. She didn't cry. Not because she was strong, though she wasn't, but because crying wasted salt and breath. She closed her eyes instead, listening to the slow tick of a neighbour's clock through the wall. Then the creak of settling beams. Then the distant cry of a night hawker, selling pies no one would buy. The city sang in its usual key, soft misery in E minor. And Clara, as always, hummed along. The following morning began not with the sound of rain, nor the choking rasp of a neighbour's cough, but with something far stranger in its rarity. Laughter. A single burst of it, small and soft but unmistakably real. Clara froze mid-stir, her spoon hovering over the porridge pot like a compass needle caught between poles. It had come from the youngest, Tommy, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor near the foot of the bed, clutching something with both hands. His smile was missing 2 front teeth, and his eyes gleamed in the weak morning light that had finally managed to push past the soot-streaked window pane. In his hands, awkwardly folded and slightly crumpled, was a paper doll. Clara crossed the room slowly, as if afraid to interrupt whatever fragile spell had taken hold. The doll was made from newsprint, the corner of an old broadsheet someone had thrown into the alley behind the building. It had been crudely cut, its arms uneven and its face drawn in with charcoal smudges. Its dress had once been a list of city council minutes. Now it had pleats and a ribbon made from laundry string. Tommy had fashioned it with the quiet intensity only children could summon, and somehow, in this damp, lice-prone, soot-covered room, the thing looked beautiful. "Where did you get the paper?" Clara asked, not unkindly, crouching beside him. Tommy pointed toward the window where a torn square had blown in through the cracked frame and come to rest behind the stove. "It was stuck there," he whispered. "Didn't tear too bad." Clara smiled, the kind that touched the corners of her eyes, but not much further. "She's lovely," she said. "What's her name?" Tommy shrugged, then looked down at the doll as if expecting her to answer for herself. By then, the other 2 children had woken and gathered round, offering suggestions, tugging gently at the doll's string belt, admiring her smudged face. For a few minutes, the room was filled with something it rarely held, the feeling that not everything was awful. Even Mrs. Ginger's, draped dramatically across a crate of firewood, opened one eye and gave a lazy blink of approval. Clara didn't say anything more. She simply let the children play, stirred the porridge a little longer, and tucked the moment into her memory like a clean handkerchief, something to hold on to later when the street noise returned and the day turned grey again. Later that morning, just as Clara was folding linens near the wash basin, a knock came at the door. Not the angry, unannounced thud of a landlord or the clipped authority of an inspector, but the light, almost apologetic tap of the postboy. She opened the door to find a boy no older than 12, red-cheeked and dripping slightly from the still falling mist, holding a thin card between 2 fingers. "Mrs. Clara Booth?" he asked, half hopeful, half bored. Clara blinked, then nodded. The boy handed over the card, gave a quick tip of his cap, and jogged off down the stairwell. The postcard was unexpected, not because Clara didn't receive post, she didn't, but because no one she knew had the money or reason to send one. She turned it over slowly, thumb tracing the soft curve of its corner. The ink was faded, written in a careful, cramped hand she recognized immediately. Her sister, Eliza. The last time Clara had heard from her was before the winter 2 years ago, when Eliza had moved north with a man who promised factory work and clean air. Apparently he had delivered on the first, but not the second. The card said little, just a note that she was alive, working at the mill, and had heard, through someone, that Clara was still in London. "You should come up if you can," it read. "The work's hard, but we eat every day." There was no flourish, no sentiment. Just those plain words, but Clara read them 5 times. She didn't respond. Not because she didn't want to, but because paper cost pennies, and postage more. Still, she placed the card on the small shelf above the wash basin between the tin cup and the dented comb, and let it stand like a photograph. The children asked about it later. Annie could read some of the words and guessed most of the rest. "Is that from your sister?" she asked. Clara nodded. "She's up north now, says it's different there." The children didn't press further. They didn't know the geography of their own poverty, only the parameters of their room, the stairwell, and the alley behind the butcher's. The rest of the day unspooled like thread. Chores, meals, sweeping, checking the floorboards for signs of more rats. Clara mended a sock with a thread too thick, then unpicked the seam and did it again. The coal box was down to its last 3 lumps, so she burned only 2. The third, she told herself, was for the next day, or the day after. She scrubbed the children's hands with cold water and vinegar, whispered a warning about lice, and combed through each head with a patience that bordered on holy. She made tea from reused leaves, then used those leaves again to patch a torn pillow seam, the stringy remnants acting as stuffing. By evening, the rain had finally eased, leaving behind puddles that reflected lamplight like bruised mirrors. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, watching the children draw in the soot on the window pane with their fingers. Little spirals, stick figures, initials traced and erased again. She didn't stop them. They weren't damaging anything that hadn't already surrendered to time. Mrs. Gingers had curled herself into the laundry basket, the very picture of comfort in a place where comfort rarely visited. And then, in a gesture so small it barely registered, Clara reached up and pinned the postcard to the wall above the basin with a sewing needle. A single card, thin as breath, from a sister far away. It did not promise rescue. It did not offer money or solutions. But it was something, a proof of life. A reminder that not everyone disappeared entirely. That somewhere beyond the grey soot and thin walls, someone had remembered her name, written it down, and trusted it would still be findable. She turned the lamp low. The fire gave its last sigh. The cat twitched in her sleep. And Clara, without knowing why, smiled, just a little, as she drifted towards sleep. The next day came dressed in bone-dry chill, not the damp, clinging cold of rain, but a sharper, clearer kind that slipped beneath fabric and turned fingertips stiff before one made it to the corner of the lane. The fog had lifted, but it left behind a sort of emptiness, as though the air had been scraped clean of warmth. Clara felt it before she even opened her eyes, the absence of the usual wall of mildew-scented heat pressing against her ribs. Instead, the room felt fragile and exposed, the cold reaching straight down through the floorboards and up through the mattress like a warning. She rose slowly, trying not to wake the children, who had clustered around the cat during the night, as if proximity to its thin warmth could ward off winter. There was no fire left. She'd used the last lump of coal the night before and hadn't had the courage to tell the children. She let them fall asleep, believing in morning heat, and now she sat quietly on the mattress's edge, wrapping the shawl around her shoulders and staring at the empty coal box with a mixture of guilt and grim calculation. The stove was cold. The kettle beside it was cold. Even the cat, who usually sprawled in front of the fire like she owned the furniture, had given up and retreated into a pile of laundry for insulation. There was no choice today. Clara would have to go to the bread line. Not the grocer's steps or the charity hall, but the parish run line near the water pump, where women queued in shawls and silence for the promise of half loaves and shame. It wasn't shameful to be poor. Everyone on the lane was poor. But it was the act of queuing itself that chipped at the soul. Standing in the open, hands folded over an empty satchel, while the more fortunate passed by, pretending not to notice, or worse, noticing with pity. Pity, Clara had learned, was the most corrosive of kindnesses. It didn't cost the giver anything, and it left the receiver hollow. She wrapped her feet in extra cloth before sliding them into her boots, the same ones with the cracked toe and sole that flapped slightly when she walked. Each step would let in the cold and possibly worse, but there was no time to worry about that. She left the children with a cup of warm water. Water warmed only from the faint heat the room had retained overnight, and promised porridge soon. Promises were currency too. They didn't fill the belly, but they kept the world from crumbling for one more hour. The queue stretched further than she remembered. Dozens of women, hunched like punctuation marks, stood with their backs to the wind. No one looked around. No one spoke. Some children whined, but were quickly hushed. Clara took her place at the end of the line, tucking her hands beneath her arms and leaning slightly forward, not in hope, but in habit. Her mind drifted. She thought of Eliza's postcard, still pinned to the wall, of the paper doll that had been carefully laid on the windowsill, wearing a new skirt made from a matchbox sleeve. She thought of the sick girl in room 2. Was she still breathing? Had anyone sat with her last night? When she finally reached the front, the man behind the table didn't even glance at her. He slid a rough hunk of bread across the plank and muttered, "Next." Clara took it with both hands. It was warm, miraculously, likely pulled from a nearby oven just before sunrise. She held it like treasure as she made her way back, cradling it against her chest, beneath the shawl, letting it warm her fingers as she walked. By the time she reached Hogsfoot Lane, her toes were numb and her right boot had soaked through completely. But she had bread. Enough to feed the children, enough to call the day a victory. The room was still cold, but the children perked up at the sight of the loaf, their eyes lighting with something close to excitement. Clara sliced it carefully, keeping the end piece for herself, tougher but more filling, and gave the children the soft centers. They ate in near silence, the occasional murmur of thanks wrapped in crumbs. She steeped the last of the tea leaves in hot water and let the mugs warm their hands, even if the drink inside barely tasted of anything but dust. After the meal, Clara placed the bread crusts in a cloth for later and turned her attention to the boots. The left one was nearing its end. She pulled it off, revealing the cloth-wrapped foot beneath, and examined the sole. The leather was more whole than material now, and she could see daylight through the bottom. No amount of patching with string or fabric would save it. She'd need new boots, which meant finding work or deeds or finding someone generous. Both were equally unlikely. Still she tried. She made her way to the alley where old Mr. Fenwick a retired cobbler with arthritis and a drinking habit, sometimes traded repairs for chores. She found him seated near the door to his flat, nursing a cracked teacup and watching the clouds with a sigh. She offered the boot, wordlessly. He looked at it, then at her, then back again. "Can't fix it," he muttered. "Not proper, anyway. You'll just fall through next rain." "I know," she said. "But could you try?" He didn't answer for a moment, then finally reached out and took the boot from her hand. "Bring me some scraps. Canvas, anything, and I'll see." It wasn't a promise, but it was more than nothing. She walked back with one boot on and one foot wrapped in burlap, limping slightly but upright. That was important. To stay upright. The room was warm when she returned, not because the fire had been lit, but because the children had gathered all the blankets and created a sort of nest near the stove. Mrs. Ginger's was buried in the middle, purring, and Tommy was reading the paper doll a story from an old receipt. Clara watched them quietly for a moment, then sat down beside them, one bootless foot tucked beneath her. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The warmth wasn't in the stove today. It was in the bread they'd shared, the tea they'd sipped, the doll in the window, and the memory of laughter. It was in the long walk, the soft bread, the broken boot, and the fact that somehow they were still here. Cold, hungry, tired, but still here. That evening, the wind changed. It crept in slowly at first, not with the bite of a storm, but the shiver of something unsettled. Hogsfoot Lane had its own rhythms, and Clara knew most of them. The rattle of carts over wet stone, the coughing fits that echoed like clockwork from the third floor, the creak of bed frames as neighbours shifted in their sleep. But this wind was different. It whistled through the gaps in window frames and moaned softly through the keyhole like a forgotten lullaby. She sat awake by the dim oil lamp, listening to it, her hands busy with mending, but her mind drifting in that quiet, sleep-heavy space where thought and dream braided together. The lamp guttered now and then, its wick near spent. Still, she coaxed it along with small sips of oil, unwilling to give in to full darkness just yet. The children were sleeping in their corner nest, the paper doll tucked between them like a talisman. They'd named her Nora. Tommy had decided it after hearing the name whispered in the street by a flower seller. "It sounds like someone who doesn't get cold," he'd said. Clara hadn't corrected him. Why should she? If Nora was to be their warm-hearted paper protector, then let her be so. There was enough chill in the world already, she thought again of Mr. Fenwick, and the boot he'd taken with his grumbling hands. If he fixed it, even poorly, it might get her through the next stretch of wet mornings. But he'd asked for scraps, and scraps were harder to find than bread these days. Fabric didn't fall from the sky, and the charity bins had long since been picked clean by those quicker or more desperate. Still, Clara had an idea. It meant revisiting the refuse pile behind the matchstick factory. Not a place she liked, with its sour stench of chemicals and the ghosts of burned fingertips, but it was known to occasionally yield cast-offs, burlap, fraying coats, even a sleeve or two if one knew where to look. She set out before dawn, wrapping her foot again in rags and pulling on her one good boot. The streets were wet, not from rain, but from the condensation that clung to stone and brick when fog pulled away and left its breath behind. Her foot thudded softly as she walked, a sound like footsteps on thick cloth, and each step sent little darts of cold up her leg. Still she walked with the quiet urgency of a woman on a mission, dodging early vendors and stepping around puddles that mirrored crooked rooftops. The factory yard was still. No workers yet, just the remains of yesterday's labor. A few crates, the faint hiss of a still smouldering refuse pile and the slow drip of something viscous from a cracked gutter. Clara moved quickly, kneeling beside the heap of discarded material that had been pushed into the corner of the yard. She sifted through broken slats, ash-caked cloth, and heaps of paper too soggy to read. At first, nothing. Then, beneath an old crate, she found it, the sleeve of a woolen coat, detached but mostly intact. The fabric was stiff with dirt and heavy with moisture, but it was real wool, not the cheap woven stuff that fell apart in rain. She tugged it free and turned to go, only to find herself facing one of the factory boys, perhaps 15, coal-marked and sleepy-eyed, a matchstick tucked behind one ear. He looked at her for a long moment, saying nothing. Then, as if deciding it wasn't worth the bother, he shrugged and turned back toward the loading bay. Clara exhaled. The sleeve tucked under her arm, she slipped back into the alleyway, her breath puffing out in little clouds, her toes growing numb again. She didn't run. Running drew attention, but her pace quickened all the same. By the time she returned to Hogsfoot Lane, the lane had begun its usual rustle of life. Neighbours dumping pots, children chasing rats with sticks, someone shouting about fish that smelled more like yesterday than today. The stairs to number 14 groaned under her weight, each step a reminder that no structure here was ever fully dry. She opened her door to find the cat staring at her as if she'd been gone a year, and the youngest boy still asleep, curled around the tin mug like it held secrets. Clara placed the sleeve on the stool beside the stove and removed her boot with a long sigh. Her ankle ached, but she'd made it. She didn't wait long. She took the sleeve, cut it open along the seam with her sewing scissors, dull but serviceable, and trimmed away the worst of the stains. The rest she folded carefully, pressing the wool flat under the weight of the bread tin. By the time she brought it to Mr. Fenwick, her hands were red from cold and her stomach was rumbling, but she held the cloth like a peace offering. He took it without a word, gave her a look that hovered somewhere between reluctant admiration and mild irritation, and disappeared back inside. He returned 2 hours later with the boot, patched, mismatched, but whole. "Won't last forever," he said, "but long enough, maybe." Clara nodded, offered a quiet "thank you," and placed the boot gently beside the other. She didn't cry, she didn't smile either. She simply held the pair in her lap like a matched set of tools, one repaired, one loyal, and both essential. That night, the wind rose again. It howled this time. A deep, mournful sound that slid under doorways and rattled the windows in their rotting frames. Clara lit the lamp and placed a blanket at the base of the door. The children huddled together, Nora, the paper doll, clutched tightly in Tommy's hands. Clara sat near them, her back to the wall, the boots beside her, the postcard from Eliza watching silently from the shelf. She didn't speak. She simply listened, to the wind, to the creaks of the old boards, to the steady breathing of the children, and felt, for the first time in days, the smallest ember of something close to peace. Clara rose early, not because she planned to attend service, but because Sunday was washing day, the only one where the pumps were less crowded and the landlord was less likely to be prowling the stairwells. She began by folding the blankets, shaking out the crumbs and cat hair, smoothing each one with slow, firm hands. The children stirred but didn't rise. They knew the routine, and that Sunday mornings brought them a little more time in the warmth. The cat, ever ceremonial, stretched luxuriously and leapt up to the windowsill, where she could keep watch on the rooftops like a sooty gargoyle. From the shelf above the basin, Clara pulled the shirt, the only one her eldest boy wore when they went anywhere important. It wasn't a fine shirt, the collar was frayed, and the cuffs bore the ink traces of a long-lost school pen. But it had buttons, mostly matching, and a faint striping that suggested it had once belonged to someone respectable. She washed it with care, scrubbing the underarms with vinegar and lye soap so thin it snapped in half when she pressed too hard. The water in the basin turned grey quickly, flecked with dirt and the ghosts of the week. She wrung it out with the strength of habit, then hung it near the stove on the cord she used as a clothesline. It would take hours to dry, but the children knew better than to touch it. She washed the stockings next, then her own shift. The cloth had thinned so much that holding it to the window made it transparent, but it still held shape, and that was enough. She caught sight of her own reflection in the basin water as she rinsed. Not a mirror, but a blur of a face, tired, hair pulled back in a lopsided knot, smudges beneath her eyes that no amount of scrubbing ever removed. She didn't look away. There was nothing frightening about her own face anymore. Later that day, after the washing had been hung and the children fed on warmed oats and the final bit of carrot, Clara opened the small tin on the shelf, the one with the cracked lid that once held lozenges and now served as her miscellaneous box. Inside were pins, one thimble, a stub of charcoal, and a folding spoon. It wasn't for eating, too delicate, but for shaving curls off a block of yellow soap whenever she needed laundry suds. She hadn't used it in weeks, but the sight of it brought a strange comfort, like a relic from a more orderly time. She carried the tin to the corner where her son's boots sat drying. He'd outgrown them, of course. They all outgrew things before they could wear them through. But Clara had lined them with scraps and reinforced the toe so he could stretch their life another month. She checked the sole. Still holding. Then she checked the other. The one Mr. Fenwick had patched. That one, too, had survived another day of city stone and filth. Small victories. She lined them up neatly beneath the bench, as if such care might coax them into lasting a little longer. Outside, the street was shifting toward dusk. Smoke from hearths and stoves began to rise, thin and purposeful, curling into the air like messages. Clara opened the window just an inch, enough to smell the beginnings of stew from someone's flat below. Likely turnips, maybe even meat, though that could have just been imagination. She watched the street in silence, eyes following the puddles of light cast by the flickering gas lamps. A man in a felt coat passed, hand in hand with a child. A dog with no collar sniffed at the gutters, then darted down an alley as someone shouted. Above it all, laundry fluttered like banners of surrender. Sleeves, skirts, trousers, all dancing in the wind, each with its own story of wear and weariness. Back inside, the children were quiet. The eldest girl, seated near the foot of the bed, was stitching the hem of her brother's trousers. Not well. The thread was uneven and the stitch wide, but with focus. Clara said nothing, only nodded once. Learning to mend was a rite of passage, even if done clumsily. The youngest had fallen asleep curled beside the stove. Nora, the paper doll, clutched in one hand, a breadcrumb in the other. The cat guarded him with a tail flick and an occasional yawn. As evening deepened, Clara set water to boil, not for food, but for washing hands and faces. Sunday night meant beginning the week clean, or as close to clean as circumstances allowed. She dipped a cloth in the steam, wrung it out until it no longer hissed, and wiped each child's hands, then cheeks, then foreheads. None complained. The ritual was gentle, like a lullaby spoken with fingers. Finally, she sat again, back against the stove, eyes half-lidded. Her hands smelled faintly of lye and soap scrap. The shirt still hung above the cord, damp at the cuffs but otherwise drying well. She glanced once more at the postcard pinned to the wall. Eliza's words were faded but legible. "The work's hard, but we eat every day." Clara didn't envy her sister, but she held the card in her thoughts like a compass. Not a direction to follow, but proof that the road continued somewhere. Outside, a gust of wind knocked something loose on the roof. A bit of tile, perhaps, or an old bird's nest. Clara didn't flinch. She just reached down, pulled the frayed blanket over her legs, and let her head rest back against the wall. Around her, the room hummed softly, with breath, with fire, with the whisper of cloth drying in the dark. Sunday was over, tomorrow would come. But for now, there was warmth enough to sleep. Monday was not a cruel day, but it was unyielding. It offered no illusions of rest or reprieve. It simply resumed, steady and indifferent, as though the week before had never ended. Clara felt it in her bones before she even opened her eyes, in the tightness of her shoulders and the ache behind her knees. The chill hadn't broken overnight. It had settled, finding corners and crevices to nest in. The kind of cold that made you move slowly, not out of reluctance, but because your body had learned that rushing cost more energy than it saved. The stove had gone out again during the night. She'd burned the last of the charcoal splinters and some of the rags that couldn't be repurposed. Now the little firebox sat like a disappointed mouth, open and grey, filled with ash that drifted if you so much as breathed near it. Clara crouched and stirred the ashes anyway, as if some ember might still be hiding beneath. There wasn't. Her fingers came away coated in soot, and she wiped them absently on her apron, already marked from yesterday's labour. Breakfast was thin. Yesterday's bread crusts soaked in warm water and a pinch of salt, eaten quickly before they grew too soft. The children didn't complain. They ate with the same quiet efficiency as soldiers roused from bunk, alert but not fully awake, already bracing for the day's march. Clara made sure each child had a scarf, checked the youngest's shoes, still holding together for now, and pressed a kiss to each forehead. They would walk to the edge of the factory district again, looking for scraps, odd jobs, anything. It wasn't safe, not exactly, but neither was staying indoors with nothing to eat. Once they were gone, Clara turned to her usual rhythm. She began with the washing, as always, though there wasn't much left to launder. The shirts had already been rinsed, the bedding aired out. So she turned to the wall instead. The inner side, near the stove, had begun to darken with soot. It wasn't dangerous yet, but if the landlord saw it, he'd call it neglect. She fetched her cloth and her ragged bar of lye soap, dipped them in water gone tepid overnight, and began to scrub. There was a particular kind of exhaustion that came with cleaning filth that wasn't yours. Clara knew it well. The soot, after all, came not just from her stove, but from the city itself, from every chimney on the lane, from the matchstick factory, from the coal carts and candleworks and the bakery's blackened ovens. It settled like judgment, indifferent to walls or windows. As she scrubbed, her knuckles turned red and her fingertips began to prune, the soap stinging at the cracks already formed by a dozen winters. By mid-morning, her arms were sore and the wall only slightly lighter, its grimy pallor reduced to a weary grey. She stepped back, massaged the small of her back, and caught sight of herself in the sheen of the window pane. Just a blur again, hair tied back, sleeves rolled up, streaks of ash on her cheeks like war paint. She looked older than she felt, and yet somehow younger than she was. Poverty did that. It stole years from your face and gave them back in your joints. She allowed herself a break, just a moment, and sat by the stove with her hands in her lap. She pulled one up, examined her nails. Underneath, tiny crescents of black ash had settled into the soft skin. No matter how often she scrubbed, they stayed. Not dirt, exactly. More like residue. A mark of her trade, a badge of survival. She didn't feel shame in them, but neither did she feel pride. Later, she made her way to the communal courtyard to shake out the blankets. Other tenants were there, a few men hauling buckets, 2 women muttering over laundry lines. Clara nodded to them but said nothing. She preferred to keep her distance from the talk, not because she disliked company, but because talk too often turned sour. People in the slums didn't gossip like gentry, they didn't have the energy for malice. But they speculated, they worried aloud, and worry was catching. Still, she listened. It was impossible not to. Word had spread about a new case of fever, not in their building, but 1 street over. A child, just 4, gone in a night, no warning. The mother had screamed so loud they'd heard it on Hogsfoot. "They're sending someone from the board," one woman muttered. "Inspections, maybe even the watch." The other sighed, adjusted her basket. "They'll look at our walls, count how many to a bed, pretend they're shocked." Clara said nothing, but a flicker of unease settled in her gut. Inspectors meant records, records meant questions, and questions meant risk. She returned upstairs, blankets freshly shaken, but still clinging to dampness. The room smelled faintly of vinegar and starch. She took stock of the shelf, 1 onion, a heel of stale bread, and a small tin with 2 spoons of sugar. A feast by their standards. She didn't cook, not yet. The stove still cold, no coal left to burn, but she wrapped the bread, tucked the onion out of the sun, and poured herself a cup of water. It was cloudy. She drank it anyway. By dusk the children had returned, wind-chapped, tired, but intact. They'd found nothing. Not today. The factories were slow, the deliveries already done. Still they brought stories. A man who juggled apples for coins, a dog that chased its tail until it knocked over a crate of eggs. Clara listened with a half-smile, spooning out the onion into broth made from water, salt, and hope. They would eat, they would sleep, and then they would do it all again. That night, as the room darkened and the oil lamp flickered for the final time, Clara sat with her hands in her lap, staring down at her fingers. The ash was still there. It would be tomorrow too. But her hands were strong, and the children were safe for another night. That was enough. Rain returned on Tuesday, not in the dramatic, thunderclap sort of way that made people run for cover, but in the slow, drizzling sort that simply existed. Ever present, ever dripping. Like a bad habit, the sky refused to break. It didn't pour, it seeped. Through cracks in the roof, between cobblestones, along window sills and doorway seams. Everything felt a little damp. The walls seemed to sweat, and the floors gave off a chill that curled up from the toes and didn't stop until it pressed gently at the base of your neck. It was the kind of rain that didn't soak you outright, but left you tired just from enduring it. Inside Clara's room, the air was heavy and metallic, tinged with the smell of rust from the basin and damp wool from the children's coats. She'd hung them near the window on lengths of twine, hoping they might dry before mildew claimed them. The cat had given up entirely and taken residence inside the wooden cupboard beneath the basin, occasionally peeking out with the air of one who would sue for eviction if she could write letters. The children, for their part, were quieter today. They'd been out early and returned not long after, shoes squelching, cheeks red, empty-handed, but not surprised. Clara hadn't asked what happened. She only helped peel off their sodden socks and set water on to warm. Enough for tea, if not for morale. There wasn't much to do in the rain, not unless one wanted to court a new cough. Clara turned to small things. the slow, idle tasks that made a poor woman's life feel manageable. She sorted the sewing tin again, lined up the buttons by colour and shape, untangled a nest of thread with her teeth, and polished the dull needle against her sleeve until it gleamed slightly in the lamplight. She considered starting a new patch on the boy's trousers again, but decided to save that for a different kind of day. Some work required energy. This was not that day. Instead, she pulled the basket from beneath the cot, the one that held her scraps. It wasn't much to look at: frayed cloth, torn sleeves, lengths of ribbon too short to tie around anything but a finger. But each piece had its own small history. She ran her fingers over a bit of faded muslin that had once been the hem of her wedding shift. Thin now, soft as breath. Another scrap of floral cotton had come from a handkerchief left behind in the courtyard by a woman who'd moved on, or moved out, or simply disappeared. And there, curled at the bottom like a secret, was the red ribbon. The ends were frayed beyond repair, but the colour had held. It had belonged to her daughter once, a birthday gift when there'd been pennies to spare, and a market stall that sold dream-coloured threads. Clara turned it over in her hands, smoothing the fabric flat with her thumb. The girl still asked about it sometimes, thinking it was long gone. Clara had never had the heart to explain she'd kept it tucked away, too precious to lose and too delicate to use. She tied it around the paper doll, Nora, carefully making a sash across the smudged newsprint dress. It looked ridiculous and perfect. The children noticed immediately. "Is that the birthday ribbon?" asked Annie, eyes wide, but not accusing. Clara nodded. "Only for today," she said, "to keep Nora warm in the storm." Tommy grinned and nodded solemnly, clearly approving of such a ceremonial duty. The youngest simply leaned against the wall, eyes half-lidded, chewing on the inside of his cheek. Not out of boredom, but because the day and the rain had made everything feel slow and syrupy. Outside, water trickled in every direction. It pattered on rooftops, gurgled through broken gutters, and dripped from eaves in a rhythm so steady it almost replaced the ticking of a clock. No one called out in the street. No carts passed. Even the hawkers seemed to have taken refuge elsewhere. The whole of Hogsfoot Lane felt like it had been sealed inside a damp envelope and left under a leaking pipe. Clara didn't mind the quiet. Rainy days had a kind of mercy to them. No errands, no charity lines, no inspectors on rounds. Just time, stretched out in thin slices. She spent some of it brushing her daughter's hair. It had grown past her shoulders again, and though it tangled like wire, Clara took her time. The brush had lost half its bristles and most of its handle, but it still did the job. The little girl sat patiently, eyes closed, humming a tune with no words. When Clara finished, she smoothed the hair back with both hands and kissed the crown of her daughter's head. The girl didn't speak, just leaned slightly back against her for a moment, as if anchoring herself. As night crept in, imperceptibly, since the grey had never left, Clara boiled what remained of the onion and crumbled the last of the bread into the pot. It wasn't much, but the scent of it filled the room with a kind of false richness. The children lit up, even if their bowls were more water than broth. They ate slowly, using the back of their spoons to scrape the last of it from the sides, then sat cross-legged in the lamplight, while Clara read to them from an old medical pamphlet someone had dropped on the stairwell. It wasn't a story, not really. Just advice on how to treat bunions and avoid excessive emotion. But she read it in a voice full of character, and the children laughed in all the right places. By the time she tucked them in, all three bundled together like a single, many-limbed creature under a single threadbare quilt. The rain had begun to slow. The gutters still gurgled, but the drips had spaced out like a tired song coming to its final notes. Clara sat a while longer, ribbon still in hand, fingers smoothing its frayed edge again and again. The room was dark except for the lamp's dim glow. The stove hadn't been lit, but somehow the room still felt warm. Outside, puddles reflected the flickering light of gas lamps and the broken geometry of roofs. Inside, everything was still. The ribbon lay across her lap like a thread between past and present. Tomorrow would likely be dry, or colder, or worse. But tonight, the storm had stayed on its side of the glass, and inside, Clara and her children were still dry, still quiet, still here. The next morning arrived like a footstep, muffled in ash. Not sharp, not loud, just steady. A presence rather than an announcement. The rain had finally broken, leaving behind a thick stillness that settled over Hogsfoot Lane like a curtain drawn against both sun and cheer. The sky was the colour of unwashed linen, pale and heavy with no promise of change. The city seemed to hold its breath. No birds, no bells, just the slow creak of damp beams and the occasional distant clatter of a coal cart navigating uneven stones. Clara woke before the children, stirred not by sound but by the dull ache of a body that had been still too long. Her limbs protested as she sat up, the mattress beneath her sighing softly with the straw's tired shift. She slipped her feet into the patched boots and stood slowly, adjusting her shawl. The air was colder now, the kind that found its way into bones and waited there. She crossed to the stove and opened the door, though she already knew, empty. The ashes inside were dry and powdery, whispering faintly as they shifted under her breath. There was no fuel left and no coin to buy any. The children had gone 2 days without a proper fire, and Clara had managed to hide the worst of it by heating water early, pretending it was enough, lighting the oil lamp longer than she should to mimic warmth. But the pretense was wearing thin. They were pale. They huddled more. Even the cat, ever aloof, had become clingier, seeking body heat where once she had scorned it. Something had to give. She didn't go to the charity hall or the breadline, not this time. Instead, she went to the coal yard, not to buy, she hadn't the coins for even a single scoop, but to watch. The yard was run by Mr. Bertram, a wide man with a thin moustache and a knack for pretending he didn't see people unless he chose to. His yard was a maze of barrels and carts, half covered in black dust, the air thick with a scratchy grit that coated the tongue and burned the nose. Clara stood near the entrance, watching the boys unload, waiting for the moment she needed. When one of the carts tipped too hard and a small avalanche of coal spilled near the fence, Clara moved. She didn't dash. Dashing made you suspicious, but she stepped in quickly, grabbed 3 small lumps from the edge of the pile, and tucked them into her satchel in a motion so practiced it felt like second nature. No one stopped her. Mr. Bertram was busy yelling at one of the lads about speed or spillage or something else that didn't matter. Clara walked away as casually as she could, her heart thudding hard but steady. By the time she returned to the room, the children were awake, rubbing eyes and checking the window for sun. There was none. Just the same grey sheet of sky and the slight flicker of movement in the courtyard. Clara didn't speak. She simply opened the stove, arranged the coal carefully, like it was an offering, and lit the match. The flame took slowly, crawling over the dry splinters she'd kept hidden in a tin. When it caught, a low, reluctant warmth began to spread. Not much, but enough. The youngest child clapped quietly. The cat, ever theatrical, rolled over and stretched in the glow. With the fire humming softly, Clara stepped outside to shake the dust from her skirt and caught sight of the girl from room 11. Nell, maybe? Or Nettie? She was crouched by the water pump, scrubbing something against the stone. Clara watched for a moment before walking over. The girl looked up briefly, nodded, then went back to her work. "Sure?" Clara asked gently. The girl nodded again. "Got grease from the bakery crates," she said, voice low. "I thought it would come out." Clara crouched beside her and took a corner of the cloth. It was coarse wool, barely dyed, stained deep with something slick and sour. "Try ash," Clara said after a pause. "From the stove. Rub it in dry first." The girl blinked, surprised. "Ash?" Clara nodded. "Cuts grease better than soap sometimes." They didn't say much else, just worked side by side, passing the cloth back and forth, dipping it into the icy water, wringing it out with stiff fingers. At one point the girl laughed, a soft, unexpected sound, and Clara felt her mouth tug in response. Not quite a smile, but something near to it. When they finished, the stain had faded, not gone, but gentled. The girl stood, nodded again and said, "Thanks, miss." Clara only tipped her head in reply. It felt like something unspoken had passed between them. Not friendship, but alliance. A shared understanding that surviving meant noticing each other now and then. Back upstairs, the room was warmer. The children had found their rhythm again, folding rags, tracing pictures in the window condensation, sorting buttons for no reason but to hear them clink. Clara set a pan over the stove and cooked what little they had. Flour thickened with water and salt, flattened into cakes and browned on the iron. They called them poor man's biscuits, though the name felt too grand. Still the smell filled the room, and the children's eyes brightened, and even the cat stirred enough to supervise. Later, as the sky began to darken, though it had barely changed, Clara sat beside the stove, hands wrapped around a cup of weak tea, and listened to the sounds of her children sleeping. The coal glowed low. The room smelled faintly of warmth and flour and dust. Outside, the city whispered its secrets through the cracks in the wall. And inside, for just a little while longer, they had heat. 3 days after the rain broke, just as the warmth of stolen coal and fried flour cakes had lulled the household into a rhythm resembling peace, the inspector came. Not announced, not expected. He simply arrived, like weather or bad dreams, wearing a hat too new for Hogsfoot Lane and a coat whose buttons gleamed like they'd never seen coal dust. Clara saw him from the window, first as a blur in the corner of her eye, then more clearly as he approached number 14 with a clipboard tucked beneath his arm and a pen dangling from a chain like a watch. He didn't knock. Inspectors rarely did. Instead, he spoke to the landlord at the bottom of the stairs, words too low to hear but sharp enough to carry. Clara moved quickly, not in panic, but with the precise urgency of someone who knows what must be hidden before someone else decides it matters. She folded the blanket that had holes in it and placed it beneath the cot. She tucked the extra pair of shoes, the ones missing soles, behind the basin. She ran her fingers over her children's cheeks, straightened their collars, patted down their hair. The youngest still had flour on his chin from breakfast. She wiped it with the edge of her sleeve, quick and quiet. The inspector's steps on the stairs were distinct, clipped, clean, too certain for the building's usual creak. Clara glanced once more at the shelf, the sugar tin still empty, the tea caddy nearly so, and sat beside the stove, posture straight, hands folded in her lap. The fire was low, burning what remained of her scavenged coal, and she hoped it gave off the right impression. Resourceful, but not wasteful. The kind of heat one earned. When the knock came, a single, sharp rap, Clara stood and opened the door. The inspector did not smile, he rarely blinked. His eyes swept the room like cold drafts, pausing on each child, each coat hook, each corner. He stepped in without waiting, made a note on his clipboard, and began. Name? Clara Booth. Number of occupants? 4. Ages? She gave them. Employment? Day work, sewing, mending, laundry when I can get it. Children's employment? Scraps, errands, nothing formal. The questions were dry, but their edges were not. Each one had the potential to mark her. Too many in a room, too little work. Any of it could be written into ink and handed over to a board that had never once walked the lane in winter. He tested the window, the frame of the door. He tapped at the wall near the stove and sniffed slightly at the smell of mildew. He made more notes. Then he turned to the children, asked their names, asked if they went to school. Tommy, the eldest, answered proudly. We went last spring, he said, until Mum had to pay the shoe tax again. Clara held her breath. The inspector's pen paused, then resumed. Do they share a bed? He asked. A blanket, Clara said. But the floor is theirs. Any signs of vermin? Only the cat, she replied, and regretted it at once. Humour was not currency in these exchanges. He closed his clipboard with a quiet snap. There will be follow-up, he said, depending on the board's review. Of course, Clara replied. She kept her voice level, calm. It was all theatre. She was the stage, the children, the props. The cracks in the ceiling were scenery. Even the coal in the stove was part of the performance. Proof of minimal warmth, not extravagance. The inspector stepped out, his boots too clean for the stairs. When the door clicked shut behind him, the silence that followed was louder than his questions had been. The children exhaled as one. The cat slinked out from beneath the cupboard and resumed her post. Clara stood still for a moment longer, listening to the retreating sound of the man's feet on the street below. Then she turned, sat down again, and reached for the kettle, half full, still warm. She poured what was left into cups, handed them out without speaking. No tea inside, just hot water, but the ritual helped. That night, sleep came slowly. Every creak of the stairwell sounded like a follow-up. Every murmur from the street below seemed to carry the sharp edge of an official voice. Clara lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, tracing the pattern of mildew with her eyes. Her thoughts moved in circles. Would they be relocated? Would someone come for the children? Would she be judged unfit because she hadn't lied well enough about the holes in their clothes or the number of spoons? But dawn did come, the sky pale again, but clear. No further knocks, no letters slid under the door. Just Monday turning again. Plain and undramatic. Clara rose, washed her face in the basin, and rubbed the stiffness from her wrists. The children stirred slowly, quieter than usual, sensing the tension still clinging to the corners of the room. Clara smiled at them, not a big smile, just enough to smooth the worry from the youngest's brow. She didn't speak about the inspector, they all knew. There was nothing more to say. Instead, she busied herself with breakfast. Porridge stretched with water, sweetened with memory. She opened the window just enough to let out the sleep-stale air and let in the fresh city filth. Outside, the neighbour across the lane was already shouting at her husband. A coal cart rumbled past, slower than usual. 2 boys chased a chicken down the alley and disappeared with a whoop. Life, as always, had decided to continue. Clara watched it for a moment, one hand resting on the sill, the other cradling her tealess cup, and whispered under her breath, "Still here." The week drifted forward with the heaviness of wet cloth, slow, weighted, and without clarity. Days blended into one another, as if the hours themselves had tired of keeping separate identities. Clara moved through them like a practiced spectre, her motions efficient, her eyes alert, but her mind suspended just slightly above the physical world. She scrubbed, she stirred, she stitched. And all the while, her thoughts unfurled like a spool of thread left to roll quietly across the floor. It was in the evenings when the light dipped just low enough to cast long shadows behind the cupboard that she allowed herself the quieter tasks. Not mending by necessity, but mending by insistence. Small seams, loosened hems, socks with wear-thinned toes. She stitched slowly, carefully, not because the cloth demanded precision, but because the act of stitching allowed her to breathe. In a world where so little could be controlled, weather, wages, the landlord's temper, the inspector's ink, a straight seam was a silent defiance, a whisper that said, "I choose to care." One of those evenings, as the children lay curled together near the stove, whispering stories of market monsters and invisible chimney sweep ghosts, Clara worked on a coat. Not for them, but for the girl from room 11. Nell had asked quietly, awkwardly one morning by the pump. "It's torn at the shoulder," she'd said, not meeting Clara's eyes. "And I've only the one." Clara had nodded and said, "Bring it after supper." And that was that. Now the coat lay in her lap, its shoulder seam unraveling like an old argument. The fabric was rough, navy blue, peppered with specks of coal dust so embedded they looked like freckles. Clara worked by lamplight, fingers sore from the cold but steady. She didn't rush. The needle moved in and out, the thread pulling tight with a whispering rhythm that matched the breath of sleeping children. As she worked, her thoughts turned again to the inspector. It had been 4 days, and still no return, no letter, no summons. But the silence didn't comfort her. Silence in places like this was often just a held breath before bad news. Still, she kept her head down, she kept her hands busy, she stitched. When the coat was done, she folded it neatly and placed it near the door for Nell to collect. Then she sat back, rubbed her temples and stared into the quiet flicker of the stove's dying fire. The shadows danced across the walls like tired ghosts, flickering in and out of corners. The room was still. Even the cat, who usually prowled the room at night as though auditioning for a role in a play only she could see, had gone silent, curled into a tight coil beneath the bench. Clara leaned back against the wall and closed her eyes. The ache in her lower back pulsed gently, but not sharply. Just a reminder. A gentle knocking from the inside, saying, "You're still here." And she was. Somehow, with holes in her shoes, coal dust beneath her nails, and a needle still threaded in her lap. Not triumphant, just present. The next morning, Nell came early. She knocked once, then waited. Clara opened the door and handed her the coat without ceremony. Nell took it with both hands and held it against her chest like it was something more than stitched fabric, like it was safety itself. "Thank you," she whispered, voice almost lost in the stairwell's draft. Clara nodded. "Keep the seams dry," she said, "and if it rips again, bring it back." Nell's smile was quick and real. "I will." Then she was gone. That afternoon, Clara found a surprise in the stairwell, tucked into the crease between the 3rd and 4th step, almost like a message smuggled through time. A small tin, dented, rusted, and unmistakably hers, filled with what looked like raisins. Not many, maybe a dozen, but real, sweet raisins. She opened the tin, slowly, reverently. The children would love them. She would not ask questions. In the world of Hogsfoot Lane, kindness was rare and best not interrogated. That night, she soaked the raisins and folded them into flour and water to make tiny cakes. Barely enough to be called such, but to the children, they might as well have been made from chocolate and sugar dreams. They ate slowly, savouring each bite as if it might be their last. Which, in a way, was true. Treats were by nature temporary. Afterward the children dozed early, full-bellied and soft-eyed, and Clara sat again by the stove, her own piece of raisin cake untouched in her lap. She'd saved it not out of hunger, but out of instinct. It seemed too pretty to eat all at once. Instead, she nibbled the edge and watched the city darken. The gas lamp outside her window flickered into life, casting long golden light across the wall. The streets grew quiet. The coat fennel was gone. The raisins were eaten. The inspector had not returned. For one moment, the world felt paused, as if it were holding still just to let her rest. She leaned her head against the wall, eyes half closed, and let the warmth from the stove gather in her chest like a small, quiet fire. Tomorrow would come, full of damp clothes and unkind air, and perhaps another pair of shoes needing patching. But tonight there was stitching, there was sweetness, there was silence. And in the silence, Clara was still, like the last page of a book no one wanted to end. The weather turned again. Not dramatically, no storms, no sudden frost, but with that creeping shift that told your bones long before your brain caught up. Clara felt it in her knees first, the faint tightness when she bent to pick up a dropped spoon, then in her wrists as she wrung out the cloths she used to wipe down the windowsills. It was in the air. Drier now, but colder. The sort of cold that felt neat and brittle, like thin porcelain just before it cracks. It brought with it a light wind that whispered through the hallways of number 14 and swept fine layers of dust into places they had not yet touched. Clara spent the morning wiping surfaces that didn't matter. The lip of the doorframe, the knob of the wash basin, the sill beneath the cracked pane of glass. She didn't do it for cleanliness. She knew the city would deposit its soot again by sundown, but sometimes, just sometimes, it felt like the only thing she could control. The rag in her hand moved in slow circles, and her thoughts followed the same path, looping back to places she hadn't visited in years. It was the cold that did it, that made the mind wander into old parlours and out-of-reach kitchens. She remembered her mother's scullery, bright once, with herbs drying on strings above the sink and floorboards polished with beeswax until they smelled sweet. She could see the sunlight from that narrow back window, the way it slanted across the table in late afternoon and lit up the flower moats as if the air itself were baking something. Her mother's voice came back too, not in words, but in tones, soft, brisk, firm, loving. A voice like folded linen, warm but with edges. Clara had been 12 when she left that home, handed off to a cousin in exchange for help with sewing and keeping accounts. A different house, a colder one. There had been mirrors in that house, and ladies who wore gloves indoors. Clara had watched them from the kitchen doorway, had mimicked their posture with a broom handle and whispered their words when she thought no one could hear. But she never belonged. And when the cousin remarried and her services were no longer required, she left without ceremony. Just a coin in her palm and a note pressed into her hand. "You'll manage." She had, in a way. There had been boarding rooms and factory shifts, laundry shops and long walks through London's maze of alleys and markets. Somewhere in there she'd married. Somewhere in there he died. Somewhere in there the children had arrived. Loud, beautiful, confounding. Now, in the dust-shadowed light of her tenement room, Clara stood still and let the memories settle like ash. They didn't sting, they just existed. Part of the air now, woven into the wood grain and the folds of the curtains she had sewn herself. The children stirred. The youngest had taken to sleeping longer lately. Growth, perhaps, or just fatigue. She touched his forehead. Warm, but not worrisome. and adjusted the fraying blanket that barely covered his toes. The other two were whispering over a page torn from a book, making up stories to go with the illustrations. A dog in a hat, a man with a sack, a bakery with cakes that floated. Their laughter was soft and rare, like bells in fog. Clara warmed yesterday's porridge on the stove, thinned with water and bulked with a pinch of flour. It wasn't delicious, but it was warm, and that mattered more. As they ate, she looked at each of them. Really looked. Annie had developed a habit of pushing her hair behind her ears every few minutes, a nervous tic Clara hadn't noticed until just then. Tommy, already taller than his boots allowed for, had begun to speak with the rhythm of a man. Short phrases, measured silence. The youngest still carried his ragged scrap of blanket everywhere, even though he insisted he was too old for it. Clara said nothing. There were worse things than clinging to softness. Later, while the children dozed again, this time from the heaviness of warm food, Clara returned to the task of mending. A new shirt had come her way, or new to her at least. Someone had discarded it on the fence near the bakery, and she'd spotted it before the dogs got to it. It was striped cotton, soft from wear but intact, except for a long tear down the back. She unpicked the seams carefully, sitting by the stove, her knees covered in the fabric like a second lap. As her fingers worked, her mind drifted again, but this time not to her past, to theirs. What would the children remember of this? The smell of boiled cabbage, the taste of sugar only once a month, the cold nights, or the stories whispered under shared blankets, the warmth of feet tucked against each other, the sound of her voice reading from a medical pamphlet as if it were Dickens. She hoped, silently, fiercely, that they would remember the softness, the efforts, the stitching. The shirt took hours, but she finished it. The tear was gone, replaced with a nearly invisible line of backstitching. She'd even added a button from her tin, mismatched, but functional. She folded it gently and placed it on the stool by the stove. Tomorrow she'd let Tommy wear it. His old one was more thread than cloth. Outside, the gas lamps sputtered to life. A horse whinnied 2 streets over. Someone shouted, then laughed. The city moved like a sleeping body, restless, heavy, half dreaming. Inside, Clara lit the lamp and pulled the curtain closed. The room grew quiet, save for the breathing of her children and the soft tick of something dripping near the basin. She didn't fix it. Some sounds, she'd decided, belonged to the rhythm of the room. She picked up her needle again, more from habit than need, and began stitching a scrap of fabric into a square. She didn't know what it would be yet. A patch, a handkerchief, maybe another dress for Nora, the ever-watchful paper doll now faded from love. The fabric whispered through her fingers, and for a little while, that was enough. Outside, the dust kept moving. Inside, Clara stitched. It began as a sound, soft at first, almost part of the natural breath of the building. The sigh of tired wood, the creak of joints that bore too much weight for too long. But then it returned, not once, but twice. A rattling like bones in a tin, or marbles spilled in a narrow drawer. Clara paused mid-stitch, needle frozen just above the fabric in her lap, and tilted her head toward the floor. Nothing. Then again. A rustle, a knock, a drag, subtle, subterranean, real. Number 14. Hogsfoot Lane was not a silent building. It groaned in the wind, hummed in the rain, and whispered in the corners during sleep. But this was new. Not threatening, not at first, just unsettling. Clara placed the needle down gently, careful not to disturb the sleeping children, and crouched near the stove. She pressed her ear to the floorboards. Nothing, just the dull, rhythmic beat of her own heart, and the ever-present far-off clatter of a city too large to ever truly rest. She told herself it was rats. It almost always was. London's belly crawled with them, and the slums were their palace. Still, something about the sound nagged at her, not skittering but slow, not claws but scraping. And yet, as the fire crackled and the lamplight flickered, she let it be. There was no use hunting ghosts when your life already swam with them. She returned to her stitching, though the rhythm was gone. The thread tangled twice and the needle pricked her finger. Shallow, but enough to draw a bead of red. She sucked at the wound absently and watched the children stir in their sleep. Annie murmured something about cinnamon, a dream, perhaps, or a memory too far to chase. The youngest shifted, pulling the blanket tighter. The room felt smaller suddenly, not in space but in sensation, like the walls had inched inward, just enough to notice, just enough to crowd. Morning came with a gust. Wind funneled down the alley and shoved its way through the cracks around the window frame. The curtain fluttered weakly, and the fire, what little was left of it, wheezed. Clara rose early, the dull throb in her knees announcing the weather before the sky confirmed it. She wrapped herself in the shawl and set about building the day, brushing hair, warming water, counting buttons, slicing bread, thinner than it deserved to be sliced. The children left after breakfast, bundled as best as rags would allow. Clara kissed each forehead and watched them vanish into the haze. The city swallowed people whole this time of year. Between fog and smoke, it became a labyrinth with no center, only exits. She closed the door and turned back toward the stove. That was when she saw it, the gap. It had always been there, technically, a sliver between two warped floorboards near the cot, hidden beneath a mat and ignored for years. But today it was wider, barely so, a hair's width. But Clara noticed the mat had shifted, likely during the night, revealing a darkness beneath that wasn't just shadow, it was void. And now the sound returned, unmistakably real. A shuffle, a soft clink, then silence. She didn't scream. Screaming wasn't part of her vocabulary anymore, but she did fetch the poker from the stove, not as a weapon, but as a probe. She knelt and gently prodded the floorboard. It moved, slightly, smoothly, lifted at the edge just enough to reveal what lay below. She paused, took a breath, then eased the board up. The space beneath was dry, remarkably so, and deeper than she'd imagined, not a crawl space, not quite a hiding place, more like a forgotten cavity carved by time or mischief. And in it, something wrapped in cloth, old cloth, brown with age, stiff at the edges. She reached down, hand steady, and lifted it out. It wasn't heavy. Inside was a bundle, buttons, bits of wax, 2 crumbling candles, a pewter spoon bent at the handle, and beneath all that, paper, folded, thick with dust. Clara set it on the bench and unwrapped it carefully. A letter. Ink faded to the color of storm clouds, the handwriting slanted, careful but hurried. It spoke of illness, a fever, a child, and a plea. Should anything happen, remember the bundle. It is yours now. Use it well. No name, no date, just that. A secret sealed beneath the floorboards for who knew how long? Clara stared at the objects on the bench. Useless, most of them, sentimental perhaps, but not survival tools. And yet, the candles, whole enough to burn, the buttons finer than most of hers, brass maybe, and the letter. Someone had written it in hope, or fear, or both. And now it had found her. She tucked it all back into the cloth and placed it in the cupboard, beside the sewing tin and the box of ribbons too short to use. It wasn't treasure, not really, But in a world that offered so little in the way of mystery, it felt like a gift. A reminder that this life, this dirty, soot-stained, lice-pricked life, was layered. Beneath the hunger and the struggle, there had been others. People who'd lived and loved and hidden things in the floor, hoping someone like her might one day lift the board. She replaced the mat, pressed it flat with her palm, and stood slowly. The sound had stopped. The room was quiet again. She made tea from leaves already brewed twice, and drank it slowly by the window. Outside, a cat crossed the street. A boy hollered at a cart driver. A woman emptied a bucket. Life continued. But now Clara knew the floor remembered. It was rare, almost scandalously so, but it happened. A day of sky, real sky, not the usual smeared grey wool that draped itself over Hogsfoot Lane, but a stretch of clear blue, bright as a ribbon in a shop window, unclouded and honest. It arrived with no announcement, no sunrise worth speaking of, just a gradual brightening that turned soot into shimmer and made even the puddles on the cobblestones sparkle like shallow treasure. Clara noticed it first when she opened the window to air out the blankets. The breeze that met her face wasn't the usual sour mix of smoke and meat gone off, but something gentler, thinner, cleaner. The kind of wind that hadn't passed through too many chimneys. She blinked against the light and let the blankets flap in it, their frayed corners dancing as if they too had been waiting for this day. The room felt lifted somehow, like someone had cracked open the world and let it breathe. The children noticed too. Annie's eyes grew wider, and Tommy stepped to the window without being asked, just to stare. The youngest let out a sound that was halfway between a gasp and a laugh, a bright, clear thing that startled even the cat, who promptly knocked over an empty mug in protest. Clara turned to the cupboard and pulled out the best of what they had, not fine, but clean. They would go out, they would walk, not for errands, not for coal or crusts or buttons to mend, just to feel that impossible ribbon of sky stretch over their heads. They left together just after breakfast, Clara's satchel filled with nothing more than a rag and an apple, the last from the barrel behind the bakery. The streets looked different in the light. The grime was still there, of course, but it wore itself differently, as if the city were trying on its Sunday best, smiling shyly from beneath its usual rags. Shopkeepers swept their stoops with more enthusiasm, and neighbours nodded with something like warmth. The dogs even barked with less menace. They walked along the edge of the market, past stalls selling limp greens and cracked teacups. The children ran ahead sometimes, returning breathless with questions. Why are there so many pigeons? Can we keep this feather? Do you think the Queen ever sees a day like this? Clara smiled and nodded and let them run. Their laughter curled up into the blue like smoke, and for once, it didn't vanish. It lingered. They reached the park, not a grand one, but the patch of green near the workhouse, where grass managed to grow between patches of mud. A few other families had come too, faces tilted toward the sun, as if trying to memorize it. Clara spread the rag across a bench and sat with her back to the wind, letting it tug gently at her hair. The children rolled in the grass, chasing each other, falling, rising again. For a moment, no one coughed. No one looked cold. Even the cat, brought along in a bundle of blanket, perched regally at Clara's feet like a queen in exile, blinking slowly at a passing butterfly. It wasn't a picnic, not really. The apple was split 4 ways, the slices small enough to make you feel the bite, but sweet enough to make it count. Clara chewed slowly, letting the juice settle on her tongue. She hadn't tasted apple in weeks. Not like this, not in light that made everything taste like memory. The blue above seemed endless, as if the soot had given up for one day, decided to rest. She remembered blue skies from childhood, chasing chickens through her grandmother's yard, bare feet in grass, sunlight so strong it turned her hair gold. It was a long time ago, but not gone, not entirely. Somewhere in the layers of soot and grief and survival, that girl still lived. She looked at her children, sprawled on the grass, noses pink from wind, faces slack with joy. They had nothing, no toys, no pennies, not even second-hand sweets, but in this moment, they were whole. She closed her eyes and let the breeze comb through her thoughts. No errands today, no inspectors, no water pails or stitching, just this. Blue so honest it felt like a lie. The walk back was slower. The sun had begun its descent, but it hadn't given up yet. Its light slanted down the alleyways and turned the bricks golden at the edges. People lingered outside their doors longer than usual. One woman even sang, off-key, a lullaby from her homeland, probably, and no one told her to hush. Clara walked behind the children, one hand resting on the satchel, now empty of apple, the other brushing lightly against the wall as she passed. Back at the tenement, the room greeted them with familiar smells, stale wool, old soap, and something vaguely floral that Clara couldn't place. She smiled. Maybe the sun had managed to sneak in while they were gone. Maybe it had left a little behind. She lit the lamp early, not out of need, but celebration, and the cat stretched across the windowsill like she, too, had remembered something worth living for. Supper was thin, bread dipped in broth, the last of the onions gone, but no one seemed to mind. The children ate with cheeks still pink from wind and eyes still full of blue sky. They asked for stories, and Clara gave them 3. She told them of kings who disguised themselves as chimney sweeps, of girls who lived in clocks, of cats who ruled entire villages with nothing but silence and one golden bell. They listened like royalty, heads on laps, hands tucked beneath their chins, every breath sinking to the rise and fall of her voice. When they slept, it was deep. Clara sat by the stove with her feet wrapped in the wool scarf she hadn't worn all day and stared at the flame. The wood she'd burned tonight had been saved for emergencies, but today felt worthy. A celebration. A page turned, a small blue ribbon tied gently around an otherwise grey chapter. Outside, the stars peeked through what little remained of the soot. Clara tilted her head just enough to see them through the corner of the glass. 1, 2, 3. Still there, still burning, like hope. Smudged, but stubborn. And in the stillness of that night, she whispered to no one at all. More of this. Just more of this. The blue sky day slipped quietly into memory, soft around the edges like well-washed linen. By the following morning, the grey had returned, not angry, just indifferent. A sky of stale porridge stretched taut overhead. But it didn't feel cruel. Not today. The children woke slowly, their limbs tangled beneath the threadbare quilt, cheeks still rosy from their day in the sun. Even the cat seemed lazier than usual, opting to bathe herself at length on a pile of Clara's clean rags, rather than her usual perch by the stove. Clara rose before them, her feet pressing softly into the cold boards as she moved through the space with a quiet that came not from exhaustion, but peace. She filled the basin with yesterday's rainwater, still cool, and dabbed it over her face with a square of cloth that smelled faintly of lavender. A miracle scent that must have come from one of the market scraps last week. She didn't question it. Some blessings were best accepted without too much thought. With the children still resting, she turned to her small collection of paper dolls. They were tucked behind the basin shelf, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from damp. Clara unfolded them one by one, careful not to tear the edges where water had once curled the newsprint into fragile fronds. There was Nora, of course, her face long smudged away, but still noble in posture. And her companions, Miss Letty, with the bonnet of inked daisies, and Lord Bram, who had been constructed from a tea advertisement and wore one boot and half a monocle. These weren't toys in the proper sense, not for the children anyway. The children had long since outgrown them, or pretended to, but Clara still tended to them, mended their creases with paste, painted new ribbons when she found the right scrap of colour. Today she sat cross-legged by the stove and began stitching tiny garments from her leftover bits. A scrap of yellowed muslin became a shawl, the hem of a child's old sock transformed into a waistcoat. She didn't talk as she worked. She let her fingers move, guided not by purpose, but by rhythm. It was a ritual, not for distraction, but for dignity. In a world where everything felt borrowed or bruised, these dolls and this world of pretend gave her a corner of creation. They lived in parlours she imagined into being, sat on velvet chairs she stitched from lint and stiff card, drank tea from button-sized saucers, and hosted evening gatherings by the glow of the oil lamp. They never shivered. They never missed meals. They always had matching buttons. By mid-morning, the children rose, rubbing their eyes and stretching like kittens. The oldest helped stoke the stove. No coal today, but some dry sticks and paper rolls that would do. Clara served porridge from the pot, this time sweetened with the tiniest scrape of molasses she'd managed to trade for 2 mended handkerchiefs. The youngest licked the spoon, sighed dramatically and declared it nearly cake. Clara laughed, not a loud sound but full, warm. It startled her. Laughter always did. It was too round, too alive for this room. And yet it fit. After breakfast, Annie asked about the dolls. She hadn't shown interest in weeks, but today she knelt beside Clara and picked up Miss Letty. "Her shawl's nice," she said. "She looks warm." Clara nodded. "She is," she said. "And she's hosting a tea tonight, invitations only." The girl's eyes lit up. "Can I make the biscuits?" "Of course," Clara said, and reached for a bit of folded cloth they could pretend was dough. They played like that all morning. Not loud, not silly, just gently. The children made paper food and lined up thread spools as guests. They placed the dolls on the windowsill where the light from the cloudy sky made them look real in a way that tugged at something deep in Clara's chest. Not sorrow, not quite. Something older, something like love. When the tea was done and the dolls tucked away again, Clara stood and stretched her back. The ache there had become familiar, but it didn't stop her. She fetched the sewing tin and a new pile of garments brought by the woman down the lane, trousers with knees blown out, a pinafore missing every button. She began sorting, setting aside the worst pieces for patching, the better ones for trading. Her hands moved surely, quickly, as the children napped on the floor, bellies full, eyes fluttering. The quiet of the afternoon wrapped the room like a shawl. The only sounds were the soft scrape of needle against fabric, the occasional creak of a shifting beam above, and the murmur of wind through the tiniest gap in the window frame. The stove's warmth pulsed faintly, just enough to keep fingers flexible. The cat stretched across Clara's lap for a while, then migrated to the children's feet, kneading her paws into their blanket as if stitching comfort of her own. Clara finished 2 shirts before dusk. She folded them neatly and tied them with string, then placed them in her satchel for delivery tomorrow. Payment would be in bread or soap or maybe nothing, but it didn't matter. The act of giving shape to something from ruin, of reclaiming use from what others cast off, gave her more than coin ever could. As night fell, she lit the oil lamp, trimmed the wick, and stood by the window for a long while. The sky, though clouded again, still held the faint echo of blue near the horizon. a memory of light. She touched the glass, felt the cold seep into her fingers, and whispered something under her breath. Not a prayer, but close. That evening, the dolls had their tea. Miss Letty wore her shawl. Lord Bram wore his monocle. And Clara, curled near the stove with her children close, and the room quiet but not empty, felt something like safety pressing against her ribs. The world outside could be damp, dim, and unforgiving. But in this paper-thin, thread-bound world she'd built with scraps and story, warmth still existed. And tonight, that was enough. It was the candle that drew her attention first, the one from the bundle hidden beneath the floorboards. She hadn't touched it in days, hadn't thought much of it since she'd tucked the small wrapped hoard away in the cupboard. But that morning, as she reached past it for the thread tin, the candle rolled gently toward her hand. Not far, just enough to be noticed. It was a stubby thing, unevenly shaped, its base slightly melted from long-ago heat, and yet Clara paused, her fingertips resting just against its waxy side. Perhaps it was the dimness of the sky, perhaps it was the silence in the hall, but something about that candle made her stand still for a moment longer than reason required. Then she took it out, set it in the center of the table, and lit it. Not out of necessity, but because it felt like the right sort of day to mark in flame. The light it gave was softer than oil, less certain but steady, a flicker rather than a glow. The children noticed it immediately when they woke. "What's it for?" asked Tommy, blinking in the dim. "Nothing," said Clara, brushing his hair with her fingers. "Or everything. Depends how you look at it." He didn't press, just nodded, and took his seat near the warmth. Breakfast was quiet. Bread again, this time toasted near the fire and softened with drippings that Clara had saved from her last errand to the butcher's. A kindness from the apprentice there, who'd said nothing, but gave her the wrapped scrap with a nod that meant more than words ever could. The children chewed slowly, watching the candle between bites. Its little flame wavered, casting the room in a soft, dreamlike orange that turned soot into shadow and shadow into velvet. Afterward, Clara took out her sewing and worked with the candle flickering nearby. She didn't need the light, not during the day, but its presence was a comfort, as if some corner of the world had decided to glow for her, and her alone. She patched a sleeve, hemmed a skirt, and began the delicate task of darning socks with more hole than hope. The rhythm soothed her. In, out, pull, knot. Each stitch like a small affirmation. Still here, still trying. The knock came just after the children had gone to market with a neighbour. 3 short raps, then a pause. Not hurried, not heavy. Clara set down her work and opened the door with care. It was Mrs. Bramley, the widow from the 3rd floor who rarely left her room, whose knees crackled with each stare, and whose shawls always smelled faintly of cloves. She stood there with both hands wrapped around a parcel, her expression as unreadable as chalk on wet stone. "I thought perhaps," Mrs. Bramley began, then stopped. She looked down at the parcel. "I found this in a drawer. Meant to pass it along sooner, but then the rain came, and I forgot." She held it out. "Thread, some needles, a bit of lace. You might find use." Clara accepted the bundle with both hands as though receiving something sacred. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more deeply than she could say. "Would you like to sit a moment?" Mrs. Bramley nodded, slow and regal, and stepped inside. Clara helped her to the bench near the stove, placed a cushion beneath her back, and poured her a cup of warm water steeped with mint. Not fresh, but dried, saved from months ago when a grocer's boy had dropped a crate. The two women sat quietly for a time, the candle flickering between them, the air thick with memory and mint. Then Mrs. Bramley spoke, voice roughened by age and disuse. "You remind me of my sister," she said. "She kept her hands busy too. Even when there was nothing left to mend, said it kept the worry from pooling in her elbows." She chuckled, a dry, lovely sound. "We used to call it elbow thought." Clara smiled, her own hands resting now in her lap. "I suppose I've got a bit of that." Mrs. Bramley leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "You've done well, in this place. You've kept warmth where most let it go." Then, almost as an afterthought, the inspector told the landlord he was surprised. "Said your room was the only one without a child sick or a bed unturned." Clara blinked. "He told you. Landlord's niece helps me now and then. She talks, I listen." Mrs. Bramley shrugged. "You've been seen, Clara, in ways that matter." For a long moment neither woman spoke. The candle fluttered once, then stood tall again. When Mrs. Bramley finally stood to leave, she placed a soft hand on Clara's shoulder, a gesture so rarely offered that Clara had to close her eyes against the rush of feeling it brought. "You're holding the threads, dear," the older woman said. "Just make sure they're yours." After she left, Clara sat by the candle again. It had burned low, a soft pool of wax gathering at its base. She watched it melt, slow and golden, and let herself remember all the hands that had brought her here. Her mother's, the cousins, the neighbor boys, even the hands that had hidden this very candle under the boards long ago. She didn't move until the children returned, their cheeks pink, fingers cold, and arms filled with crumbs and ribbons and stories. They noticed the candle, now almost gone. "What's it for now?" Annie asked. "For remembering," Clara said, "and for lighting the next one." And when the flame finally flickered out, the room remained warm. Even in the slums of Hogsfoot Lane, time moved forward, not kindly, not swiftly, but with the weary persistence of a street vendor's cart rolling over crooked stones. Winter whispered its coming with sharper air and deeper shadows. The windows frosted at the edges, and breath became visible before sunrise. But inside number 14, inside that quiet room above the stairwell with the crooked stove and fading wallpaper, something had shifted. Not in circumstance, but in texture. Life had not softened, but it had found its rhythm. The days came as they always did, shaped by need and repetition. Clara rose early, wrapped her shawl tighter, and began each morning with ritual. Water from the pump, fire coaxed from scraps, bread sliced thinner than cents but always shared. She patched and sewed and stirred, her hands constantly in motion, as if they knew that stillness bred worry and kept it away by sheer movement. The children grew quieter, older in the eyes but not in the soul. Annie began helping with mending, her stitches still crooked but improving. Tommy ran errands with purpose, not complaint. And the youngest, bright-eyed and ever watching, had learned to warm his mother's slippers beneath the blanket before she rose. Their world had not grown easier, but it had grown more known, and in knowing there was comfort. The days blurred, one into the next, like smudges on a window pane. But in each day, Clara found something to hold on to. A neighbour's nod, a rare second cup of tea, a ribbon washed clean and used to tie back Annie's hair. These were victories, quiet ones, the kind no history books would ever bother to record, but real all the same. One afternoon, after the market had emptied and the children were napping, Clara sat by the window with a square of muslin in her lap. She wasn't sewing it, not yet, just holding it, running her thumb along the edge. The sun had come out briefly, laying a soft patch of gold on the windowsill, and she let herself sit in it without working, without guilt, just warmth. She thought of the dolls tucked away behind the basin. She hadn't brought them out in days, but their presence lingered in the room. A tiny world within a bigger, harsher one. And she thought of the candle now burned to a stub, the wax cooled and hardened in the corner of the table. There was no need to relight it. The memory of its glow was enough. Outside, a cart passed slowly, its wheels creaking in time with the rhythm of the city's breath. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere down the lane, a child sang a song about a fish with boots. Life went on, untidy and unremarkable, and yet beautifully bearable. Clara shifted in her seat and looked around her room. The peeling walls, the threadbare curtain, the patched coats hung neatly by the door. It was still a place of lack, but it was not a place of defeat. She had made it something more than survival. She had made it hers. That evening, as the sky darkened, she lit the oil lamp and gathered the children close. They ate soup made from bones and turnips and love, and afterward they shared stories not from books, but from memory. Stories of grandmothers with pockets full of honeycomb, of kittens who ruled over bakeries, of brave children who climbed chimneys and found stars at the top. Later, as they curled into sleep, limbs tangled, breaths soft, Clara remained by the stove a little longer, mending a tear in Tommy's coat. She worked slowly, not because it was difficult, but because she wanted the act to last. When she tied off the final stitch, she placed the coat over the back of a chair and smoothed it down with the flat of her palm. Then she stood, moved quietly through the room, and checked each child. A blanket tucked here, a curl of hair brushed aside there. She kissed their foreheads one by one, the way her mother used to, as if sealing a letter with invisible wax. At last, she returned to her chair by the stove, pulled the shawl tight around her shoulders, and closed her eyes. The room was warm enough. The world outside was cold, yes, but not closing in, not tonight. And in that moment, just a breath, just a pause, Clara Booth allowed herself a luxury rarer than tea or coal or sugar. She rested.